put this together and started briefing it to the National Weapons Labs in January. Okay. At the time, they said, oh, well, why would anyone talk about this? After all, we know they're never going to meet. And we know they're never going to talk about arms control. I said, I have a different read. They've talked on the phone. He's got a lot of maybe even personal reasons why he wants to have those meetings. And it's going to happen. I made that very clear in January and March. And lo and behold, here they are. And this is what Trump's strategic weapons agenda kind of looks like. Nuclear proliferation is the biggest problem in the world. If we do something ideally to get rid of them, maybe that's a dream, but certainly it's a subject that I'd be bringing up with Putin. Okay, well, it's a start. Putin's agenda is a little more specific. And I think a little worrying if you've been keeping score on what Trump has said about some of these things and what his senior advisors have been saying over the years, people who I personally have had a chance to talk with privately more than a few times. Extending New START. Well, wait a minute. Who promoted and got the ratification of New START? Come on. Obama. Well, wait a minute. What made him run? Insults from Obama. What is his MO? To do the anti-Obama. So this is an odd thing. And some of his advisors told him when this first came up in the first phone call to say that that was not something he wanted to talk about. So that's the first item. INF treaty issues. Who's in violation of the INF treaty?
Russia.
Russia. Okay. The INF treaty was put together by President Reagan and assisted by Bush. The violations were not very well handled by President Obama, according to the critics. Non-placement of weapons in space. Well, wait a minute. Trump has just come out with a space policy that kind of says that way of framing the problem is kind of nutty because there are a lot of objects up there that might be capable of doing military things, and you can transit through it if you have a ballistic missile and you've got weapons in space. And then, oh, my favorite, upholding the Iran deal. Well, I'm sure, you know, this is not exactly what Mr. Trump has in mind if he's thinking about what he wants to talk about. This is his agenda, not Trump's. Okay, well, what might a Trumpian agenda entail, you know? Now, I want to make it this clear. Just because I can think this out doesn't mean, oh, well, boom, oh, yeah, we'll do that. But if you can't even figure out what it might be, you may not have an agenda even after Trump. So it's a good thought exercise. It would support U.S. military strategic objectives. It would be, well, it has to be competitive. Why? Because, well, that's the buzzword, right? Got to stick with that. It would exploit economic and technological trends that advantage the United States. It would not only inform our discussions with the Russians, but our diplomacy towards other nations as well. I mean, you know, these are very generic things. Okay, I thought I'd go back to political science because we're in a department of political science, and if something is sound, I'll even repeat it even if it came from political scientists, okay? And in this instance, this is pretty good. Does anyone know who Thomas Schelling is?
Okay. That's the other book that everybody in
I
strategy
see.
has
Well,
to
okay.
memorize.
Well, really, this is all you need to remember and probably ever will, you know. I studied constitutional law for 4 years. I can tell you what I remember, but it isn't what I studied, which was voluminous in comparison. Roughly, these 3 points are important, that the objectives of sound control initiatives and military science can be reduced to 3 things that are common. They should reduce the probability of war, reduce the destructiveness of wars if they occur, and reduce military expenditures. Sound military science can do this. Sound arms control can do this. If you mate them up together, they can do it better. Okay? At least that's the thesis we're pushing today. Okay, well, why is that point important? I'd say because increasingly there are two groups where they're crowding out that thought entirely. The first group is the nuclear deterrence. There's even a hat that says, "Make deterrence great again." We can find it on the web. I'm sure they can buy one. And this school says, you know, if we have kind of open carry, which means you can bring a gun to class. Can you imagine what the grading system would look like? It'd be so uniform and at a very high level. I once had a police officer or two in the class I taught at Loyola 40 years ago. They were guaranteed C's, even though, frankly, there was a lot of trouble in that. Their grammar, to say nothing of putting verbs and subjects together. But they were in good shape. They carried in the class, by the way. With enough guns pointed at everyone's back, we just walk in a circle, we should be fine. You know, it's been suggested that, you know, with more of these things out there. And you could even have someone carry a bigger gun, and maybe someone would drop theirs, but they'd get behind the person with the bigger gun. Someone said they worked on alliances, roughly, something like that, yeah. Now, there's a bit of a problem with this. You're counting on none of these people getting bored or worse, you know, excited. And we see, with the case of handguns at least, by analogy, what happens when that happens. It's very awful. But, you know, maybe they know what they're doing. You're banking on that never happening, boredom or excitement. And then there's this other group. Now, this is a little unfair. They're for zero. I say it's a little unfair because I actually own a tandem. I do not own a recumbent. I think that's too much for me. You'll notice they're wearing a fanny pack, and I despise those things. I think, you know, I'd have to go to Renaissance fairs and dress up and do all sorts of things if I went on a recumbent. But, you know, it could be they're just ahead of their time, you know, and I'm just kind of like, you know, I'm getting old, and I just don't understand it. So the first group rarely sees a weapon, proposed strategic weapon system that they don't like, or a proposed negotiation they're fond of. With the other group, it's pretty much 180 degrees in the other direction. Now, if you put these people at it in a debate, and you know, in the old days, these people were on the tails of the curve of distribution of thought. Now they've consumed practically the entire hump of the middle. And what happens is you have an election, and one group gets in, and then the other group gets in. And that is going to be pretty destabilizing to budgets, common sense, and probably our safety. You're young. Welcome to your future. So, for that reason, they don't think this way. You can tell I have a partiality to trying to get to that hump again. All right. One way to approach people who are you know, enamored of their arguments is to do the most desperate thing in public policy, which is refer them to the law. Now, generally people don't read this, and the idea that they implement it is even rarer still. But in law, the nuclear posture review, does anybody know what that is? Does anybody know what the nuclear... Yes, well, the professors will save us. Go ahead.
A review of America's nuclear posture.
I hope you're not paying as much as they are asking for the course. It's a review that justifies what forces we have, what forces we need, and how it fits into our security narrative more generally. How's that? Try that. Okay, there you go. He gave me a thumbs up, so we're cleared for takeoff here. And in that authorization in 2018, which was done in 2017, which guided the guidance nuclear posture review that was just published earlier this year, it says you need to consider the input and views from all stakeholders on issues pertaining to deterrence, nuclear non-proliferation, and arms control. So one way to talk to people who don't want to think about weapons and don't want to think about negotiations is say, you don't have a choice, it's law. Guess what? They followed it. Now, you'll be stunned to see what I just described in there. Oh my God, they're talking about the INF Treaty. If the West did not deploy Pershing II and cruise missiles, there would be no incentive for the Soviets to negotiate seriously for nuclear weapons reductions. That's George Shultz. Now, they use this as a way of explaining what the relation between the forces they're proposing is and possible negotiations. And they use the example that if you put a nuclear warhead on a missile that comes out of a submarine, that might get the Russians to come to the table and give up their low-yield theater weapons. Now, my personal view, not very likely. It's, how shall I put it? I always say it's a start. I think we can do better than an example like that, because I don't think that's terribly probable. And in fact, well, here, medium-sized minds alike. This is the memo I was referring to from last July. And I called one of the people in the blacked out area. I said, I looked at the nuclear posturage and I saw this thing, the INF. Was that because of me? And he said, you'll never be able to prove it. And I said, well, that's a start. He didn't say no. And I said, well, let me state it differently. Would anyone be able to prove that it wasn't me? And he said, he laughed, he said, I suppose not. And then he reassured me. He said, but don't worry, nobody takes this crap seriously. By the way, I'm in the business of taking things seriously that people don't. There's a reason why the military needs academia. You get paid and it get tenure, even when you're wrong. If it's lengthy, has numbers, and it's elegant. They do serious things, where if they're wrong, people die. You need to square that circle. What you're supposed to do is try to think about the things that, well, people don't take seriously, but should. Yeah. If you want to help the common good. And I hope you do, because this is the only form of government that has in its Declaration of Independence that we're supposed to be using the government to protect our happiness. And if anyone studied Aristotle, it doesn't get better than that. So we need something to protect our happiness, so we can be all that we can be. Yeah? Who said philosophy and national security, though? There you go. Anyway, so I'm running with this. I actually showed this to someone who funds me, and I said, this is what they said. And she smiled. It's okay. And I said, I'm actually going to have a project to work on this. All right, so just again, NATO had a dual track decision. It was Carter. It was followed by Reagan. It was not a partisan thing. And what they said is, they're trying to break up NATO. We'll show them. We'll deploy systems. To counter the yellow-nosed monsters, we will put out our own smarter, more accurate systems that are just for you. And of course, there were demonstrations and efforts to prevent the deployments. They failed, and we got this in '87, which actually helped Bush get elected, I think, a little, not much, but a little. Now, what's interesting is shortly thereafter, the wall fell in Berlin, and look at the numbers of the weapons deployed right after INF. That's a pretty good story. As I say, it's a critic coming from me. This should count for something.